It's been nearly a year since a 29-year-old U.S. intelligence subcontractor stunned the world with revelations of eavesdropping on a planetary scale. This week, Edward Snowden spoke to NBC from Moscow, where he's been granted temporary asylum, the first interview of its kind, describing his role, his homesickness, and promising soon fresh revelations. Revelations to come, confirmed by the journalist who helped Snowden leak the National Security Agency's operations, Glenn Greenwald, who spoke to France24 in Paris. And while the U.S. Secretary of State challenges Snowden to man up and come home to face espionage charges, the rest of the world still digesting the plain fact that the World Wide Web plays by rules made in the USA. What will the lasting impact of Snowden revelations be? Is he a patriot or a traitor? Today in the France24 debate, Snowden speaks. With us to talk about it, he may be at Harvard University, but Charles Kogan knows a thing or two about the French capital. Welcome back to the show. You're a former CIA bureau chief here in Paris. Joining us here in the studio, Olivier Chopin, recent author in French of Why is America Spying on Us? Welcome to the show. Welcome to Fabrice Epelboin. Welcome back. Fabrice Epelboin, who teaches all about surveillance, privacy, and identity in the digital age at the prestigious French political science institute Sciences Po. He blogs as Euromaestro. Political commentator Jean-Pierre Larochelle, welcome back. And welcome back as well to journalist Florence Hartmann, the recent author in French of Whistleblowers, the Bad Consciences of Our Democracies. The France24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Twitter and on Facebook, our hashtag F24debate. In his 90-minute interview with NBC's Brian Williams, Edward Snowden discussed everything from where he was on September 11th, outside NSA headquarters, to what spies learn when you look up ice hockey scores on your cell phone. But he also discussed his own future and his past job description, a spy.
Were you trained as a spy? It seems to me spies probably look a lot more like Ed Snowden and a lot less like James Bond these days.
Well, it's no secret that the U.S. tends to get more and better intelligence out of computers nowadays than they do out of people. I was trained as a spy in sort of the traditional sense of the word, in that I lived and worked undercover overseas, pretending to work in a job that I'm not. And even being assigned a name that was not mine. But I am a technical specialist. I am a technical expert. I don't work with people. I don't recruit agents. What I do is I put systems to work for the United States. And I've done that at all levels, from the bottom on the ground all the way to the top. Now, the government might deny these things. They might frame it in certain ways and say, oh, well, you know, he's a low-level analyst. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to use one position that I've had in a career here or there to distract from the totality of my experience, which is that I've worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, undercover, overseas. I've worked for the National Security Agency, undercover, overseas. And I've worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency as a lecturer at the Joint Counterintelligence Training Academy, where I developed sources and methods for keeping our information and people secure in the most hostile and dangerous environments around the world. So when they say I'm a low-level systems administrator, that I don't know what I'm talking about, I'd say it's somewhat misleading.
Charles Kogan, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I think there's a central fact in all this, and that is that Mr. Snowden, he signed a secrecy agreement with the CIA not to divulge information that is classified. This is an agreement that lasts a lifetime. So he has to answer to that. Despite what one might think of his revelations and whether they were useful or not, the point is he is in violation of a secrecy agreement and he has to answer to it.
And do you think he endangered national security?
I think if you listen to Secretary Kerry and other figures in the Washington establishment, yes, definitely.
Jean-Pierre Larochelle.
Well, I think it's quite true, and he admits in his interview that he broke U.S. law and he broke this agreement. I think you're referring to Security Form 312. But he also took an oath of office, which was to uphold the Constitution, and he points out quite clearly that that was his concern. And the reason why he released these documents, according to him, is he believed that the Constitution was under threat by the NSA security officials and the programs that they were running.
Fabrice Bellepoint?
The American Constitution is definitely under threat. There is absolutely no doubt. So I guess Snowden was between a rock and what's the American expression? And a hard place. Definitely what the NSA is doing is against the American Constitution. So my take is that Edward Snowden took the right decision.
Charles Kogan, is he, in effect, upholding the Constitution?
I noticed that one of your interlocutors is a blogger. I'm a blogger too, and I've done a couple of blogs on this issue. The first one was entitled, Better Read Than Dead. This is recalling a motto during the Cold War, except that it's the same pronunciation but a different word. My word was R-E-A-D. In other words, I can't get very excited about the possibility that someone is prying into my private life. Now, there are basically two kinds of data that the NSA is reproached for. The first is the metadata, which does not involve content. It involves information about contacts. The second is the NSA's ability to tap into the servers of internet companies, and that's the PRISM program, and get information off the internet. Now, I'm doing a project, a research project on the issue of security versus privacy. I'd like to get to the bottom of this because, you know, if you talk to these establishment figures in Washington, they say, and they're reputable people, they say that the NSA has followed legal procedures in obtaining information. And I plan to do a number of interviews on this and come up with a long article on it.
Olivier Chopin?
I think Snowden can appear at the same time as a traitor on one side and as a hero, a whistleblower on the other side. It depends on the kind of legitimacy you consider. Nowadays we have something like two competing legitimacies at the same time, one coming from the civil society and individuals, and another one coming from the states and governments. It's clear, it may be a bit too abstract to say that he endangers the Constitution of the United States. The National Security Agency acts upon the law. There are several laws coming from 2004, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Protection Act, 2007, the Protect America Act. It depends on how you will interpret those laws.
What you're saying is that it's not so much what the NSA did, it's the leeway that they got from the laws that were passed after the 2011 attacks on the World Trade Center.
Exactly. There is a political debate about how we should interpret those acts, those laws, those legal restrictions to those activities, referring to the Constitution. But it's not very clear right now that there are so many dangers for the Constitution itself. The Constitution may be the protection for the American people against the NSA in the end, not a tool in the hands of the NSA.
Florence Hartmann?
Well, I don't agree in that way that if the laws were really authorizing the authorities, the government, the NSA, or whoever, to do exactly what they are doing and what was disclosed by Snowden, so they would have discussed and debate with a special committee within the Congress, which didn't happen. So there is a different way of scrutiny in democracy, which goes for intelligence issues, for instance, through specific committees within the Parliament, the Congress in the case of the US, and through the pressure of the public opinion or the press, or the whistleblowers if it's related to information the press cannot access to. So why the government decide by itself? There is no government in any democracy which can decide by itself what is secret or not. there are laws which define very clearly what is secret or not. The law, it's transparency, the secrecy is a limitation, a specific limitation under law. And if you don't have this respect, which is a little secrecy, a lot of transparency, you don't have any more democracy. But you need to have secrecy. But this secrecy should be legitimate, covered by law, limited, and limited the maximum, and shouldn't be against the freedom, all other freedoms, and they should coexist. So that's quite difficult, but we have a real problem in this case. There was an abuse by the US government. There is abuse, surely, by European government with this kind of, but we need someone, and we cannot have everyone because there are secrecy in the story. We need someone who says, stop somewhere.
Charles Kogan, do you agree? A good spy spies and will spy as much as possible up to the limit where they're told not to spy.
Well, you know, another thing the U.S. is reproached for is its spying on foreign leaders, and we had the example of the tapping into Angela Merkel's cell phone starting in 2002 when she wasn't even chancellor. Now, she has been reassured by President Obama that this sort of thing will stop. But he didn't go beyond that. And the Germans, who have taken this very much to heart, this whole question of spying on them, they sent a delegation, a political level delegation to Washington, and asked for a no-spy agreement, which was declined, and at that point, the German delegation left Washington. By the way, I've done a blog on this incident. So what is the answer? At the time of the joint statement by Obama and Merkel, Merkel said she wasn't satisfied with the outcome of the talks. Now, at the same time, Obama said that we do not have a blanket agreement to spy on any country. We don't have a blanket agreement against spying. Now this technically or literally could be true, probably is. But the fact is that there is this Five Eyes system whereby the Anglo-Saxon countries have a signals intelligence agreement. It dates back to 1946, which was just between Britain and the United States, and it deals with signals intelligence. It doesn't deal with spying on each other. However, there's an informal consensus that you don't spy on Anglo-Saxon countries. And for instance, when I was on a visit to London back in the 1980s, I got the very distinct impression that unilateral intelligence operations in Britain were off the table. So the Germans wanted to get in on this system, and Obama's reply is we don't have a blanket agreement on against spying, renouncing spying on any country.
Fabrice Ebelpoint.
Well, the Five Eyes Agreement actually has been extended to several countries, including France, by some agreement named Lustre, and who has been signed in 2010. Then this is part of the Snowden revelations. Actually, today, as of today, France and the United States can exchange information about their own citizens. So this echelon who has been extended by the internet and who became something that we now have all discovered as the Snowden affair is now including several countries like France and Israel, and probably Sweden also. And tomorrow we'll probably discover that many other European countries are part of this Five Eyes agreement. And those countries are spying their own population. And that's a major democratic threat.
As Le Monde revealed when it came to the French...
yeah, and 6 months earlier, The Guardian revealed the exact same thing.
In a few months back. Now, Edward Snowden, in that interview on NBC, saying there's more revelations to come. One of the two journalists who helped him go public said, as with a fireworks show, you want to save your best for last. Glenn Greenwald, who Tuesday spoke to France 24's Douglas Herbert.
The questions that people have is toward what ends is this surveillance being put and what is being done with the communications they're collecting. There, of course, have been very significant scandals in the U.S. and other countries in the past about political abuse of surveillance, targeting political opponents. And so one of the questions that we're now working on answering is exactly who is it specifically in the U.S. that they target for the most invasive forms of surveillance? Are these really people we think of as terrorist threats, or are they instead foreign policy critics and scholars and professors and civil rights leaders? And I think the answers to those questions will help shape how the story is remembered.
So should we expect now the most startling revelations are still to come, is what he's hinting?
Yes. In fact, his editor has also pointed out that the documents that have been released so far, which have been quite numerous and quite interesting, represent less than 1% of the documents that they have in their possession. So we should expect maybe 100 times more.
Olivier Chopin, your thoughts on what the next batch of revelations will bring?
Oh, I really ignore totally what is to come. It's interesting to note that Snowden himself explained that he was a patriot, a true patriot, by refraining from disclosing things irrelevant to the general public and that could endanger, for example, spies abroad or American militaries on the ground. And so he explained that he had a consciousness about his political responsibility towards the American government, and as such was no traitor. So maybe the following revelations will still be in that direction, not really revealing things too dangerous for operatives or people on the ground.
What was quite interesting was that he did somewhat tacitly acknowledge that among those secrets are military secrets, but he indicated his promise that those would not be published. And I think that was one of the concerns of the U.S. government, obviously.
All right, those military secrets, he says, will not be published. We're going to hear, when we come back, the official reaction of the U.S. government to what Edward Snowden had to say, and also to the fact that right now his home is Russia. Stay with us. This is the France 24 debate. Nearly a year after he made his first revelations about the NSA's global eavesdropping, has given a long sit-down interview to U.S. television network NBC. He did so in Moscow. With us to talk about it from, he's at Harvard University, Charles Kogan, who was in a previous life the CIA bureau chief here in Paris. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Olivier Chopin, author in French of Why is America Spying on Us? Fabrice Ebelpoint, who teaches all about surveillance and all sorts of privacy and identity issues at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Jean-Pierre Larochelle, political commentator and blogger as Euromaestro. And journalist Florence Hartmann, the recent author in French of Whistleblowers, The Bad Consciences of Our Democracy. Now, I know in your book you say it, that what inspired you to write this book was your own personal experience. You were spokesperson for the International Criminal Court covering that was dealing with Slobodan Milosevic at the time. And so what happened? When you're a whistleblower, one day in 2006 you have this epiphany. You say, I can't take it anymore?
No, I was not a whistleblower because I published a book after I left my position, and I investigate myself on a story which has not been investigated while I was the spokesperson by my former colleagues, journalists. So I jumped back as a journalist and I investigate. But the tribunal said that it's something I knew from...
Yeah, I was going to say, you took a lot of flack for it.
From the tribunal, and I couldn't protest to that because I didn't want to disclose my source. So I respect the rules of journalists. I didn't disclose my source. And I just show how the judges of an international tribunal established to punish those who commit war crimes and genocide in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda were not respecting the law, made deals with states in order to hide evidence which was about war crimes, about genocide. And I just explained exactly the information was known, but with no name. I just said it's this judge, and they sign an illegal document and decision on that day and that day. And I was convicted to 7 days in jail for that.
Now, we all, looking at the interview that Edward Snowden gave, you realize the stakes a lot higher for him since he risks going to prison, obviously, if he goes back to the United States. What was your reaction when we finally got to see him sit down, speak? What were your thoughts?
Well, that was not the first time we see him speaking and
but in a
giving
long
each
format
time.
like this.
Yes, absolutely. Well, he is in front of a big dilemma because he never refused to go in front of justice because he acknowledged, as we said, that he made one violation in order to disclose another violation. So in court, both violations should be dealt together parallelly by the judges, and not only one. Impunity for those who are said to have violated, and we have quite a lot of evidence that the rules were not respected by the NSA or other organization. And only Snowden would be judged. It's what happened with Bradley Manning. It was just, well, you violated the rules you disclosed those videos, but we never had anyone tried at the same time, or the issue of torture reintroduced in a democratic army as it was for the US.
The ills he addressed were not being addressed, you're saying, in parallel.
Yeah, that's why it's not patriot or an enemy. It's an issue of debate about democracy. Democracy has rules, framework, and everyone has to respect them. The citizen, the government, their duty, obligation, and everyone should play its own role. Otherwise, it doesn't function. And he's just opening the debate.
That's not how the U.S. government sees it. Ahead of Snowden's broadcast, the U.S. Secretary of State offering up a counter-narrative.
The bottom line is, this is a man who has betrayed his country, who is sitting in Russia, an authoritarian country, where he has taken refuge. He should man up and come back to the United States. If he has a complaint about what's the matter with American surveillance, come back here and stand in our system of justice and make his case.
Jean-Pierre Larochelle?
Well, as he pointed out in his interview, he's not able to make his case if he returns to justice because of the nature of the crimes he's accused of under the Espionage Act would require him to go into a secret court. And he would also be deprived of being able to make a defense because of security concerns. So I think it's somewhat disingenuous. Also, the issue of him being in Russia, as he points out, Russia was not his choice destination. He was en route to South America via Cuba, and he was forced to be in Russia, or to stay in Russia, because the United States decided to revoke his passport. So I think sort of throwing the Russia thing out there isn't quite clear. The other thing on this unconstitutionality issue that we talked about earlier, and the fact that it's being illegal, this has already been acknowledged, again, as Snowden pointed out in his interview, by all three branches of the government. It's been determined by the secret court that oversees the NSA. It's been determined now by an open court for the first time. By all three branches of government, it's been declared Orwellian by a U.S. court. And even the president himself has appointed 2 independent commissions that looked in it. And they've all agreed that the programs need to be reformed and changed, and they're in the process of ending the bulk collection of this data. So in terms of the points that he's raising, he's actually been vindicated by all branches of the government. So I think it's a little disingenuous to pretend like there's still a debate, well, was it illegal? Even the NSA admits in their own audit that the programs were illegal and that they illegally instructed their agents to misinform and give disinformation to the congressional oversight committees on the nature of their programs.
Charles Kogan, do you take the point?
Well, I would like to make a clarification. First of all, to my mind, there are 3 categories of countries as viewed by the U.S. for intelligence purposes. The first are the Five Eyes countries: Britain, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. In the second category, there are countries with whom the U.S. cooperates but does not have a no-spy agreement. In the third category, there are countries where there is no cooperation. Now, I did an article for the French magazine Commentaire a couple of years ago detailing the narration of the no-spy agreement that was proposed with France but was canceled by the White House. And this was the brainchild of the then Director of National Intelligence, Admiral Blair, who lost his job partly as a result of this snafu over the abortive no-spy agreement with France. Now, I'd like to make one other comment, and that is, I've read the Greenwald book, and interestingly, it is silent on how Snowden got out of Hong Kong. How did he happen to get on a Russian plane? Was he in Russian custody? Was he in a Russian safe house before he got on the plane? We don't know. I think probably what he said is true, that he intended to get to a Latin American country and the U.S. took away his passport, so he was he couldn't do it.
Are you insinuating that
Russia?
Are you insinuating that Russia helped him?
I think it's a matter of it's an open question, because it's very strange that Greenwald, who goes into great detail about how he established contact with Snowden in Hong Kong, says nothing about how Snowden got out of Hong Kong.
Fabrice Abelpoint?
It's quite fascinating, because when I was a kid, I'm 40 years old now. When I was a kid, we could witness the exact same situation with Russian spy flying to the United States to get freedom. And today it's the exact opposite. It's really astonishing how in a little less than 20 years, less than 30 years, the situation is the exact opposite.
You say it's the exact opposite.
Not the exact opposite, but really it's astonishing
let's
how
talk,
this has
Let's talk
evolved.
about Snowden in Russia. He surprised many when he popped up as one of the callers recently on Vladimir Putin's annual phone-in show with ordinary citizens. Even some of Snowden's defenders objected to it, saying it played into the Russian president's hand. On NBC, Snowden categorically denying any special relationship with Moscow and in no uncertain terms denouncing Russia's new censorship laws on bloggers.
I have no relationship with the Russian government at all. I've never met the Russian president. I'm not supported by the Russian government. I'm not taking money from the Russian government. I'm not a spy.
Charles Kogan, you're unconvinced.
I think it's possible that he's fabricating all that. We just don't know. But it's an area of shadows. We don't know exactly what his relationship with the Russians is. We have to assume that he's given a lot of material to the Russians. I think you have to make that assumption if you're deciding how to react operationally.
He says he hasn't.
What he says may or may not be true.
So you're saying the U.S. has no intelligence capabilities to determine if secrets have been leaked to the Russians or not?
We don't have any contact with him in Russia.
Cisco, maybe?
How would we know?
Microsoft?
Well, I thought that was the purpose of intelligence agencies. But
it does put Edward Snowden in. There was a lot of criticism when Snowden appeared on that call-in show, and it did make him look like he was serving the interests of the Russian president.
Yeah, I think there's a legitimate question, and I think he acknowledged that there's a legitimate question, because at the same time he's concerned about privacy laws and those not being respected. Obviously, there's a concern in Russia. He was very clear, however, in last night's program about his condemnation of the Russian program, and he acknowledged that it's a country that doesn't have respect for those rights. In terms of intelligence sharing between countries, we should acknowledge that France, for instance, has intelligence sharing arrangements with the United Kingdom, and they have shared information with the United Kingdom, and one of the conditions of sharing that information is that it's not released to third parties without the knowledge or consent of the French government. Well, what's happened in the case with the information that France has shared with the UK is the UK turns around and shares this information with the US without letting the French officials know about this.
All right. And again, these questions still being pondered. Snowden wants to go home. According, though, to journalist Glenn Greenwald, he's better off in Russia right now than in prison.
he gets to put his head on his pillow every night with the knowledge that he took decisive, meaningful action in defense of the political values that he has always said he believes in. And not many people in the world are able to say that. And that has given him an extraordinary amount of internal tranquility and peace and fulfillment that I'd say makes him probably one of the happiest people I know.
One of the happiest people that Glenn Greenwald knows. Olivier Chopin, your thoughts?
Really? I don't know. I think everything in that case is a narrative. One coming from Snowden himself, one coming from Greenwald, another one coming from The Guardian. Luke Harding wrote a book about the whole story before Greenwald released his own book. And they tend to explain the same thing. Most of it must have been accidental at some point. He did not choose to go there. He did not choose to release information at some point. He had a very strong process to contact Greenwald. That's the only thing we know for sure.
Right, so there's not always a master plan. There's sometimes a lot of improvisation.
Yes, I believe there was a mix.
Actually, there was sort of a plan because this was a strong concern of his for a long time. Because 6 months before he ever released any of these documents, he was already hosting crypto parties in Hawaii, where he was instructing and training other people on how to circumvent the surveillance programs.
All right, there's a point I want to ask the panel about, and that is Jean-Pierre Larochelle mentioned it already. There's been a wholesale rethink in U.S. intelligence circles on how they deal with this data. What is the fallout globally? Is there one here in France? I'll put it to you, Fabrice Bellepoint. Are the French having a rethink about the way they conduct eavesdropping on a planetary scale?
Well, actually, France voted a law last December that legalized global surveillance on the whole planet and on the French population. It is now legal to do so. Of course, France has been doing so since it was technically possible, which means approximately 2008.
And you think that this is in reaction to the Snowden revelations?
I think this is, yes, in some sort a reaction to Snowden, because basically it's now legal. France has been doing this for years, but for 6 months now it is totally legal, and it's legal for the executive branch to spy on everybody, especially on parliament and on justice and media, which is a really major change in the way democracy works in this country.
Is that a good thing, the fact that these
No,
laws...
I'm afraid not.
Charles Kogan.
Yes, it's very interesting, the difference in the reaction of the French vis-a-vis the Germans. The Germans have had a lot of heartburn about U.S. spying on them. The French have handled this in a very low-key manner. They sent an intelligence delegation, not a political level delegation, to Washington, and President Hollande has said that the matter is cleared up. Of course, there's been a very close relationship, both in signals intelligence and otherwise, between the United States and France. And another factor, I think,
but
is
you also, sorry, on that
France
point,
has
Charles Kogan, on that point, you have to empathize with the Germans who have still fresh in their memory the secret police, the Stasi of East Germany.
That is true. And also there is the fact that, to my knowledge, the Germans did not spy on the United States during the Cold War to the extent that the French did, and it's well known, well documented. They would rifle the suitcases of American businessmen passing through Paris and so forth and so on. We all know that. But that doesn't
did it work both ways?
Deny the fact that there's a very close cooperation between the United States and France in the intelligence arena.
Did it work both ways?
Excuse me?
Was the U.S. also spying on the French?
Of course.
Of course, and one of the issues, and Charles Kogan spelled it out at the beginning of our conversation, is that there's two levers. There's with trawling for what they call metadata, and then this business of the PRISM affair. And what's also one of the important aspects of this is this sort of public-private partnership when it comes to spying.
Yes, this is very disturbing. Actually, it was known before the Snowden leaks that there was some sort of private partnership between companies like Microsoft and the NSA, but it is happening on a much more global scale. There is still question about Google's implication with the NSA. There is still question about lots of other technological companies from the Silicon Valley. How are they working with the NSA? We still don't know. We probably will never know. But they have lost lots of confidence from the users right now. And to get back to the to the difference you were pointing out between Germany and France, it is really astonishing to see how the German population reacts strongly against the mass surveillance of the population, whereas the French population doesn't care at all.
Why?
Part of the explanation is the way German handled the post-war era and the East Germany
right,
history.
we know that part, but why don't the French care more?
I'm afraid the French...
Go ahead, Charles Kogan.
The French are désabusés, if you will. They're
Jaded.
a long-standing country in Europe, the oldest country in Europe along with England. Germany is a country only since the 19th century. The French have been doing this for centuries. They're used to it. I want to add one point. There's a third category of information that the NSA collected according to the Snowden revelations, and that is the tapping of fiber optic cables across the Atlantic. I don't know whether it was done by the British or the Americans, but it was another factor, another collection fact that surfaced with the Snowden documents.
Olivier Chapman.
The French people is also more used to be monitored by his own state and government. We have a strong tradition of political police, the renseignements généraux, things like that. We have already...
Dating back to before Napoleon.
Yeah, and our big scandal exploded under François Mitterrand when they phone-tapped journalists and average people to protect a state secret that was a private secret, his daughter. So at some point, the debates that start to emerge in the US or in Germany, we have already had them in the past. And it doesn't mean that we are less sensitive, but we are kind of used to deal with those kind of issues. So it's not necessarily a big issue for the public or the journalists.
And let me ask you this. When we're hearing the names of the companies that Fabrice was mentioning, Silicon Valley, Microsoft companies, when you hear Charles Kogan talking about the fiber optic cables being tapped perhaps, you really get a sense, here we are, 7 billion of us on the planet, but when it comes to the digital economy, it's the US and perhaps the US and the UK who own the candy store.
Yes, because for now, the World Wide Web and all its infrastructure is American. But it's maybe it's accidental history, you know.
What's interesting is that there is a concern because these companies did cooperate with the intelligence agencies, and the few companies that have tried to provide privacy to their users, LavaBit, for instance, is the email service that Snowden had used to make his contact with journalists, have been shut down because the federal government goes after these agencies, after these companies that provide these types of services and demand the keys to unlock the passwords.
So what does the future hold?
The future holds surveillance society, unfortunately.
But will it still be an American?
No, not at all. To go back to America holds the candy store when it comes to software. When it comes to Google, when it comes to Facebook, it's American. When it comes to infrastructure, France is a very big player. If you want to connect Africa to the rest of the world, if you want to connect the Middle East to the rest of the world, you have to deal with French companies. And if you want to listen to Africa and the Middle East, you have to partnership with France. And France is a really big key player in this global surveillance state that is being built right now. And it will have a really big role in shaping the 21st century. And it's not a nice role.
It's not a nice war.
It's not going to be nice. It's not going to be a democracy. It's going to be a global governance with local governance, nation states. Maybe Europe will have a role in this, and they will monitor their own population in order to have, let's say, some sort of peace and stability.
What the state governments have been able to do, actually, is to get around the constraints placed by law by having intelligence agencies of other countries collect the information and then share that information.
Or even having their own surveillance system set up in foreign state. This is the case for France. France's global surveillance system is mostly set up in foreign state. Dictation,
in any
mainly.
case, it will not be legal because there are national but also international conventions and rules which are binding for all countries. The problem is that's why French are désabusés, or I don't know. It's because you don't know to whom to turn to in order to put some.
There's a lack of checks and balances in this country.
Yeah, because well, there was a hope with the European Parliament, but it doesn't work, and there is no enough information in order to say this law or this mechanism of spying is not entitled. We don't have the elements in order to cut or to define as illegal those proceedings. That's the problem. But we have a big democracy crisis.
Charles Cogan, do you agree with that assessment? I was going to say, yeah. Do you agree that individual rights are going to be eroded as time goes on, the way it's been described by Fabrice and Florence?
Can I add something at this point? There is a reform bill that has been passed by the House of Representatives. It is now before the Senate, and the gist of it is that the metadata will not be stored anymore by the NSA. It will be stored by the private phone companies, private companies. Secondly, you cannot access this metadata except under certain restricted situations in which there is a clear connection with a possible terrorist. It's called the two contacts rule.
And do you have faith in the system? Do you have faith in the system, Charles Cogan? Do you have faith in the system?
Sorry?
Do you have faith that the system will improve going forward?
I think it will, yes, because there's a tremendous uproar, particularly among lawyers and privacy advocates about this situation. And it's crying out for reform among these groups, and I think there will be eventually reforms. But this is the first step, this new law coming into effect.
And I think
depends if the Senate approves it.
Very quick.
I think we have to acknowledge the only reason we have these reforms is because of the revelations by Snowden.
All right, we'll leave it there. I want to thank you.
That is true.
I want to thank you. Consensus on that point. Jean-Pierre Larochelle, I want to thank Olivier Chopin. I want to thank as well Fabrice Ebelpoint, Florence Hartmann, and Charles Cogan for joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.